Jacob, again, we saw him earlier. He's on Abzan Company. He did lose to Barry, but he managed to battle back. Jacob starts on an Overgrown Tomb tapped, passes to Dan. Dan has a Bloodstained Mire. He's going to go ahead and sacrifice that immediately. Likely going to be going down to 17 here, assuming he's playing Death Shadow the normal way you play Death Shadow. Sure enough, he is down to 17 with the help of a Watery Grave. Let's see what we have here. I saw in his hand a copy of Thought Scour, but I believe, he also has a Serum Visions we're going to start on instead. So here is Serum Visions. We'll draw a card. It was another Serum Visions looked like. Looking on top at a Snapcaster Mage and a basic Swamp. He's going to think what he wants to do with these two cards here. One on top, one on bottom. I have to imagine the one on top. Actually, I think it was a Swamp. I think he might have had a one-lander here. Yeah, he does. So the top card is likely that Swamp. So there's a Forest and there's a Devoted Druid for Jacob. The draw, again, is that Swamp, of course. So Dan does have the option here of Fatal Pushing and Serum Visioning. Doesn't want to leave the Druid in play if he doesn't have to. So look at the hand we have. Collected Company, Eternal Witness, Kitchen Finks, Ronus, and a Birds of Paradise. I like taking away probably the Witness, because he can't take Coco with this card. But I also like pushing. I guess you take away, I don't know. Yeah, you probably Witness. It just gives you the most value. Anything else you take, Witness gets back. So it doesn't really matter if you take anything else. You can't take Coco, which would be the one you would take if you could, but I believe Dan has a Fatal Push in hand. I could be wrong about that, but if he does, I think I'd want to use it here on the Druid if I had the chance. Dan is debating between, I think, Finks and Witness. Okay. Decides on taking the Witness. So down it goes. We're going to cycle a Street Wraith down to 15. Draw a card here. It's going to be a Temur Battle Rage. So one of in his deck there. So it wasn't actually, because what I thought was Death Shadow was actually a Street Wraith, but he does have that Fatal Push. And sure enough, he will go ahead and use it to kill the Druid and pass the turn. Back to Jacob. Jacob's draw was, I believe, a land. Yep, it's a Marsh Flats. So he would have found the fourth land for Coco. So it's a good play by Dan to go ahead and get rid of the Druid when he had the chance before Jacob got access to any more mana. We will go ahead and sacrifice our Marsh Flats. We're going to go ahead and grab some sort of land here. Basic Plains, potentially. Yes, it's a basic snow-covered plains, in fact. So 19 is our life total. Dan still looking for one of his threats, whether it be a Tassiger, a Gurmag Angler, or one of those Death Shadows. Death Shadow, of course, not castable just yet. At least not to survive if it comes into play. Whoops. Hit the wrong button there, guys. 1 second here. Sorry about that. So Jacob is going to be at 21. Dan is at 15. So there we go. Dan here, Serum Visioning. Looking at, if I'm not, like there was a Kolaghan's Command in there. I don't know what the other card was. He's going to go ahead and show Jacob that there was a Kolaghan's Command and then put it on the bottom of the deck. So Jacob knows that Dan is not drawing a Kolaghan's Command. He will Thoughtseize him. That's going to get a Coco. Yep. Let's take away Collected Company. I can't see me taking Ronus or Birds over Collected Company here, when my opponent has the potential to draw a land and just cast it. Yep. Seems like the right choice, Dan. All right, so away goes Coco, and Dan will fall to 13, and then we'll pass back to Jacob. So Jacob going to draw a Windswept Heath. So yeah, Dan again making the right plays here. Again, they seem straightforward enough, so you'd hope he would be doing so. As Jacob has drawn the lands both times, which would have allowed a collected company to be cast. He will play out Ronus the Indomitable and attack for 3. So Dan will fall to 10. Ronus right now not really doing anything. He's just going to go ahead and play out the Bird of Paradise as well here. So empty-handed for Jacob. He'll get another basic forest, and down to 20 he goes. Dan here has a Terminate, but not castable just yet. Could be looking at Thought Scour here to try and find a land. It looks like he is. He'll mill over a couple of cards and mill over a Thought Scour and a Polluted Delta. The draw, I believe, was a Death Shadow. So at least it's castable. It'll be a 3-3. But Ronus is scary now because Ronus next turn... Yeah. Okay, yeah, so there is a Death Shadow. Does a land... I'm curious if a land makes it lethal here. The Death Shadow is currently a 3-3. No, Ronus doesn't have Trample, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, Ronus won't matter. You can just block. If he needs to block, he just blocks the Ronus, of course. So right now he can pay 3 mana to give the Kitchen Finks +2/+0 and Trample until end of turn. That'll allow Ronus to attack, and sure enough, that's what he's doing. So we're going to get in for 10 points. Dan is forced to block. He's going to have to block the... Can he block Kitchen Finks? He can block Finks and survive, which will kill the Finks. The Shadow will survive the combat because all the damage dealt at the same time. So it would become... a 10-10 and would have lived, but he decides to block the Ronus anyways. He falls to 5 from the Finks connecting. Scalding Tarn comes down for Dan. So he's found his red mana. Did he drew Temur Battle Rage, right? So he could have had a 10-10, which he could have made a... Actually, I think Dan could have won this turn. If Dan had blocked the Kitchen Finks instead, that would have meant he'd take 7 points of damage, which means the Death Shadow is a 10-10. No, Ace, it is. Ronus has Death Touch. No, it shouldn't. Ronus has Death Touch. You normally don't think that a 5/5 having Death Touch matters, but it actually does here. But again, Dan actually could have won last turn. So yeah, the same reason that people are thinking that the Shadow should have lived is because when Death Shadow makes a block like that, all the damage happens at the same time. So the Death Shadow will have damage assigned to it, but so does Dan, which means his life total changes and the Shadow grows. Now, it doesn't mean the Shadow does more damage. It just means that it's bigger and doesn't die to the damage it has dealt to it. So what would have happened is Death Shadow would have become a 10-10 with 5 damage marked on it. What would have happened then, Dan would have drawn... Well, actually, I don't know if he could have won because I don't know if he plays a basic mountain. If he plays a basic mountain, he could have sacrificed Scalding Tarn, gone to make it 11/11 Death or 11/11 Death Shadow. If he plays basic mountain, got a basic mountain, and 21 his opponent, because he has, if I'm not mistaken, he has Battle Rage in his hand, so he would have 21 to his opponent, and that would have been game. So this should be game. I don't know what Dan has in his hand. Now Dan has Terminate, so Dan gets to terminate this Kitchen Finks. So Dan won't die here. And he actually gets to shock and grow his Death Shadow. So yeah, Dan goes to 2, leaving him now with an 11/11 Death Shadow. So this actually lines up the same way, it looks like. Dan's going to win here. But it took him a turn extra than it should have. His opponent... Well, the Finks wouldn't have died. Oh, yeah, sorry, the Finks would have died. Never mind, yeah, Finks would have gained life. Because it would have died to the Shadow still and gone to 22. So, yeah, no, you're right. I forgot about Finks dying there. Good catch, Ace. And you're right, it's not a good choice. Dan's actually going to Fatal Push the Kitchen Finks, it looks like. He has a choice of Fatal Push, Terminate. I don't think either one really matters either way here. Probably Fatal Push because you can Terminate if you draw a land, I guess. So he'll gain 2 life. So Jacob will go to 22. Ronus, this means, of course, cannot attack this turn. It also cannot block on Dan's turn, which is very important. So Dan drew a Stubborn Denial. Yeah, he doesn't have lethal now because of the Kitchen Mix gaining life, right? Well, I guess if Jacob doesn't block, he has 22. So Dan's hand right now is Stubborn Denial, Colligan's Command, Terminate, and Team Battle Rage. No, Ronus gives +2/+0 if I'm not mistaken. I don't think Ronus buffs toughness. Yeah, Ronus buffs only power, so it's +2/+0. Birds of Paradise attack. Yeah, 4-1. You got it. Yeah, sorry, you saw that yourself. Birds of Paradise jumps in front of the bus, dies. I think this leaves Dan. No, Dan's not dead because he gets to terminate the Finks before Ronus gets to do anything. So yeah, he's going to actually just attack with the Finks, which I think is the correct play. Dan is still forced to cast this Terminate. So sorry, his hand right now, Stubborn Denial, Snapcaster Mage, and Team Battle Rage. Oh, this is going to work out so well for Dan. He just wins now. Jeez. Jacob goes. Yeah, Dan still wins. He gets to go. Yeah, Jacob has to go for the Coco. And Dan says, I have Stubborn Denial, so good game. And yeah, this is going to be the game because Dan gets attacked for exactly 22. That Death Shadow is an 11/11. It gets double strikes. That's exactly enough to get the job done. So congrats to Dan for game 1. Yeah, it didn't. I guess I forgot about Finks coming back and gaining some more life, of course. But yeah, Dan gets there in the end. Just takes a little bit longer than I expected. All right, so heading into sideboards here. Dan, pretty familiar with the Abzan deck. He used to play Abzan quite a bit himself. It's obviously changed since he last played it, but he's played against the newer version, so he is, again, familiar with what he is up against. So he gets to sideboard knowing what he's going against, but... Are those your only 2 choices? I've played Restore Balance. Fair enough. I've played Restore Balance. For what I bought the deck for, it was fun. It wasn't super competitive, I'll say that. If you're not looking for that, obviously, then it's not a big deal. If you're looking just to have fun, Restore Balance is a lot of fun. Making your opponent sacrifice like all their lands while you get a Gargadon. It's pretty good. Blue-Black Mill is also interesting. I haven't actually played Mill. Well, okay, that's not true. I have a long time ago, but it wasn't. It wasn't anywhere close to what the mill deck is right now. I never played with like Glimpse Unthinkable and that kind of stuff. So yeah. As for Told with Restore Balance is pretty cool though. I will say that. I mean, it's the same thing. Really, you're only like your number one game plan is like Gargadon before before I restore balance you, and then you lose all your lands. And I have a 9/7. All right. The incredibly impossible hand of 4 Archive, Trap, Plains, Leyline of the Void, and Path to Exile. Sure, yeah, why not? Then your opponent just has to go ahead and play a creature and you win. I will say, so the last time I played, like when I played Mill is when I first started playing Magic. And it was in Zendikar, so it was standard. And it played like Archive Trap, Hedron Crab, all that kind of stuff. Um, once I did have the opening hand of Quad Archive Trap. I had no land, but I kept Quad Archive Trap, and this is of course in Zendikar, so everyone is playing fetch lands. So my turn one was go. He of course went ahead and played a fetch land, sacrificed it immediately. I laid down 4 Archive Traps, and that was the game. All right, so Dan gonna have the draw here. Jacob on the play. Dan has decided to mulligan away his 7. He's going to go to 6 now instead. Jacob, however, is all right with his 7. Dan going to have a look at 6. Looking for ways to interact with his opponent to stop them from comboing off, while also looking for ways to hurt himself. All right, take a look at 6 here. Teamer Battle Rage in the hand. Not usually where you want it right away, but this hand's fine. It's 6 cards. But you have a Bloodstained Mire, double Serum Visions of Thoughtseize, a Teamer Battle Rage, and one other card I couldn't get a good look at, but that's more than enough. He also keeps his card on top. So he's good to go. Jacob will start off with an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, falling to 18, and a Noble Hierarch off of the land. Dan will begin his turn here. Bloodstained Mire will start it off for him. Down to 17. I'm assuming. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he gets a swamp here. Prove me wrong, Dan. All right, there is a Watery Grave. So down to 17 indeed. Curious to see if he starts off here with Serum Visions or Thoughtseize. If he needs a land still, it's going to be Serum Visions, and sure enough it is. He's going to look at 3 cards to try and find a land. He found another Thoughtseize. There's a land, Scalding Tarn and Polluted Delta, in fact, so there's plenty of land. So if Dan wants, he can set up to draw both of those lands next turn, one for his draw step and play the second Serum Vengeance to draw the other one. He will pass the turn back. Jacob draws. He's looking at his hand here, trying to figure out what he wants to do. Dan, I will say right now, doesn't have any way to protect from the combo. Here's a Kitchen Finks, so up to 20. Dan will end of turn cycle away Street Wraiths, so yeah, that's fine. He's going to draw both his lands. Kept both on top. You wanted to make sure he has plenty of land this game. 3 4 is probably the number you want to have. 3 is enough to operate with comfortably, though. 4 just gives you a Tassiger activation, which is important sometimes. So there's the polluted Delta. Which he will sacrifice. Dan figuring out what land he wants to get here. It will be a Blood Crypt, so we're down to 14, or 12, sorry, I should say. We're going to have a Thoughtseize come down here, is my guess. Really? We're going to start with Serum Vision. Interesting. I feel like you want to start with Thoughtseize there. I think he had 2 in his hand. So I think you want to start with Thoughtseize, look at their hand. If they have... If he has 2 spells he has to worry about, and Dan can only play 1 Thoughtseize, it's going to make it real hard for him to fight through this game. I really don't know what you're looking for at this point. It's got to be a threat, is my guess. But sure enough, there's the Thoughtseize. So Dan will be at 10. And we get to look at a hand. Viscera Seer, Abrupt Decay. I think that's an Urborg. And a Godless Shrine. I don't know if that's an Urborg or not. I'm not sure what land that is. I think it's a land regardless. It might be a Verdant Catacombs, actually. It's 2 lands, Abrupt Decay, and Viscera. That's all that really matters here. Probably taking Viscera Seer in this case, as it means that your opponent is a step away from an infinite life combo. Sure enough, Viscera Seer is gone. We're going to untap and draw. The draw was a Collected Company. That's a real good draw, though. Now, Jacob saw Stubborn Denial last game. Has to be aware of that again this one. Dan does have it. If Jacob just tries to go for a Coco on Dan's end step or something like that, Dan can get him. Or at any point in Dan's turn after he's untapped. So Jacob does need to be careful of that. I think his best plan is just to fire it off now. Like, your opponent's tapped out. They can't interact with you. Coco now. Try and find some pieces of a combo. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. Attack for 4, sure. Dan's at 6. That's fine. I think not respecting Stubborn Denial is a mistake. So he is going to pass the turn here, and we're going to see what happens. Dan will untap and draw. He has a 3rd land, so plenty of mana to work with in terms of Stubborn Denial being useful this turn. Death Shadows where Dan will start. It's a 7/7. Maybe it's not where he'll start. Thoughtseize is real start instead. And it's going to work the same because Jacob's going to have to try and fire off. Yeah, I do like that because he doesn't get Abrupt Decayed this way. Does Jacob try and fire off Coco in response? Yes, he does. Yeah, this is going to walk right into the perfects for Dan. If Jacob had just said, sure, go ahead, take your pick, it would have been between Coco and Abrupt Decay. Would have taken Coco as my guess because it's the better card. But that means that Dan's Death Shadow can't come down safely. Now, I will say Dan is dead to a Path to Exile at this point. Or another Abrupt Decay. We're going to try for a Coco. Dan already shuffling, stubborn out to the front of his hand. Yep. No. Okay, we get to take away your Abrupt Decay. Dan goes to 4, left with a Godless Shrine only. So again, Path to Exile here. Dan gonna fetch. He has to shock himself to 1 to play Death Shadow if he wants to play it. Which I think you have to because it sets you up for the win next turn, right? What's at 19? Death Shadow is a 12/12, so that's 24. Yeah, it's lethal next turn. So yeah, Dan at 1 here. And I mean, if Jacob doesn't find something here, if Jacob just bricks a draw, Dan just wins, right? Like, yeah, there's Death Shadow, and just past the turn, he's praying that Jacob doesn't find a good one. Jacob found, I believe, a Scavenging Ooze. So it's an okay one. Oh, Druid, okay. Not as good as Scavenging Ooze in this case. So he found a devoted Druid, so he gets to play the Druid, though, which usually has how much toughness? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 toughness to block 24 damage, which is exactly lethal. So Dan is going to win this. Yep. Dan is going to win in 2, it looks like. The one of Temur Battle Rage coming through twice. Just turn it sideways, Dan. Even with, hold on, 1, 2, 3, so that's only 5 toughness. Even with a Gavany Township being activated, it's not enough. Yeah, and this is it. Dan should have the win here. All he has to do is turn it sideways in Temur Battle Rage. Sure, Serum Visions for safety, I guess. I don't know. He finds a Thoughtseize. Can't play it, so that's fine. You only got one choice. Like, he can't not attack and go for the win. He has to go for the win here. Like, don't play defensive now, Dan. Come on. Get it going. Sideways, let's go. Finish this out in 2. Come on, Dan. I believe in you. Turn it sideways, you win. He's afraid of Jacob having drawn a card, of course. Because he has no idea what's in his hand here. So, but I think, like, if your biggest fear is like a Coco or something like that, I guess your biggest fear is Path, or Abrupt Decay. But you would have died last turn if that was the case. So you know your opponent doesn't have a removal spell. The only thing it can be here is a Coco, if anything, or a Court of Calling, I guess. But you know it's not a kill spell because you'd be dead already if it was. Dan's starting to do some math here. You got to go for it here, right? Like, you're at 1. Like, you can't give your opponent a chance to draw another removal spell. Again, you know he didn't draw it the first time, so you got to go for it here. Come on, Dan. Again, Dan doing some math here. Got it sideways. Let's go. Putting it in front of it. Temur Battle Rage. That is the game. All right. Yes, Dan.